Hello and welcome to the Lifestyle Evolution podcast. This is Joshua Laycock. I'm not, I usually go into these podcasts with a pretty good idea of what I want to talk about and what sort of message I want to leave out there. And sometimes I make notes and sometimes I don't, but today might be a little different. And who knows? I'm just going to wing this and see where it goes. And you may not actually ever hear this one, or I may decide why not to put it out there. But today I thought I would talk about death, and not in a morbid way, not in a I'm struggling and I need to talk about these things kind of way, although hopefully part of this conversation will normalize the conversation of death a little bit so that if you are struggling, it may not feel so taboo to talk about it. And, I should say that if you are at the outset someone who is struggling with this or contemplating taking your own life, please do make sure that you have those conversations. Um, in the US and in Canada, 988 is a hotline where you can talk to someone if you are in distress. You can talk to a therapist and you can always call 911. It's not the intent of this podcast to be a conversation of suicide. That's not what I'm intending to talk about at all, but they seem to be inexorably linked. And I don't think they should be. It is probably the only, or one of the only common things that every single human being on this planet will experience: birth and death. And why am I thinking about this? I don't know. Well, I do. I've been reading a lot of one of my favorite psychiatrists, Irvin Yalom, and he's an existential um, psychiatrist. He does a lot of psychotherapy from an existential perspective, and he's one of the few, I think, at least that have written prolifically that I've come across that openly will push and talk about death in a therapeutic context, even perhaps if someone is not bringing it out. Obviously, and pardon me if I keep clearing my throat. I'll try to mute. I'm under the weather a little bit, but we're going to get through this. So I've been reading a lot about Yalom, including, interestingly, his biography, which I think he wrote probably about a decade ago when he was in his mid 80s. So, simple math that puts him um, early to mid 90s. It's not a stretch to think that that's something that he is very aware of. And he's written very openly about his relationship with death, not only his own, but of his wife. And he spent a significant amount of his career working with terminally ill patients um, in a psychiatric capacity. So I've appreciated his openness and the challenging nature of the conversations that he's had in his books, both his textbooks and his sort of educational novels. And for whatever reason, they're just kind of getting in there. Um, and I've been reflecting a fair bit on what he's had to say. And yeah, it's been a bit of an unsettling, but I'm going to say a very positive period of time for me reflecting on these things. Um, and I think in many ways, and a lot of the people who speak in this space, Yalom's certainly not the only one. They talk about the presence of death, even if it's not something that we directly consciously think about, but it weaves its way into our thoughts and into our behaviors a fair bit. And So I thought I'd reflect a little bit on some of the major moments of my life, um, and how it may have influenced me and the decisions, and how it's influencing the decisions that I'm making now in my life. Probably more directly and in a more pronounced fashion than it ever has before. Um, a quote from Yalom is really interesting. He says that the physicality of death destroys man. However, the idea of death saves him. And that really, I read that a bunch of times, highlighted it. And what a phenomenal invitation to talk about our own mortality. It's fascinating, and I thought about this when I was younger. I used to fantasize about what I would do if I could live forever. And people have always um, debated whether anyone would actually want to live forever. And a lot of the arguments that people make would be like, well, everyone that you know and love would die, and maybe I was a little cold and detached when I was younger. I don't know, but I used to say, right, but you've got nothing but time to get over it. Um, but at the time, I wasn't married and I didn't have children yet. And I think for most people, there is an inevitability about losing parents. So that idea, it's not pleasant, but it didn't rattle me in this context of would you want to live forever? But what was really interesting is I would have this list of all the things that I would do if I could live forever. Yet for some reason, as a mere mortal, um, I wasn't doing any of them, which is, looking back on it now, so frustrating. My son, who's 9, who I think I've spoken about, at least on other podcasts, he's a phenomenally thoughtful, philosophical young man. And he loves to do would you rathers. Or like if you could only pick one type of food for the rest of the life, or if you could only listen to one song or one genre of music for the rest. He does these all the time to the point where it's kind of annoying, but he does it a lot. And it's funny, he asked me, ironically, maybe a couple weeks ago, he's like, would you rather live to be 100 years old and know that you'd live to be 100, or would you rather live forever? And I think my knee-jerk reaction was still, I'd live forever. And I got the same answer from him. No, no, I think I wouldn't. I don't think I would. I don't think I would want to see my friends die. I wouldn't want to see the people that I care about die. And I got to think about those things. And I also got to think about there'd be no sense of urgency. There'd be nothing special about a life that was not time bound. And as someone who, for my entire life, I've struggled to belong and to fit in, I've always felt like an outsider. Um, it's interesting that even in my fantasies of living forever, what would I do? I would create myself as an other. I would take away one of the very human things that binds us all, which is that we're all going to die. So I've been reflecting on that and I've been thinking about it, and this concept of the physicality of death destroys man, but the idea of death saves him. It makes me smile a little bit. And now I'm 43 at the time of this recording. And I think if I have some good fortune, I'm halfway there. You know, I can't remember exactly what the average lifespan of a male in sort of North America is. It's probably mid 70s. So by most math, I'm beyond halfway there. My health is pretty good. My life is good. Yet, as much as I try to avoid cliche, I hate being a cliche. I think this is a bit of a midlife reflection. One of the exercises that Yalom talks about is drawing a line on a piece of paper and putting a dot where you think you are in the grand continuum of how long you are likely to live if some, unfortunate twist of fate doesn't snatch you up sooner. And I didn't actually do it, but I could visualize it and it just rocked me. That there's so much in my life that I have thought about doing but haven't done. And I've always described my life to a certain point, I'll talk about that, as having lived um, asleep, right? Like a zombie. And there's a philosopher, Heidegger, who kind of identifies that we have sort of two, he's another existential philosopher, and we have sort of two states of being, a forgetfulness of being and a mindfulness of being. And he says that most of us, particularly for the beginning portion of our lives, live in this state of forgetfulness of being. And it is only through some profound, urgent experience in life that we may move into a mindfulness of being, to continually be aware of our own sense of being and to move away from what he called this inauthentic self. We're not aware of the self. We're just sort of going through the motions. And man, did that ever resonate with me? I would say probably the first 30 or so years of my life. I was just on autopilot, sort of doing what I was told, doing what I thought I should do, chasing things that I thought would give me joy and contentedness. But to be honest, living as if I was going to live forever with no sense of urgency whatsoever about things that matter. And yeah, I'm a little sad that it's taken me that long to try to wake up, but it is what it is, as they say, and there's not a whole lot of sense of in self-flagellation or regret. There's nothing I can do about it. Heidegger talked about in this forgetfulness of being state that we are carried along by the nobody. And I thought, my goodness, that is such a marvelous expression that we are just carried along in life by the nobody. And we need these urgent experiences to really snap us into a sense of mindfulness and awakened state. For me, I think the first moment, this first quote unquote urgent experience of my life was having my first child, my son, almost 10 years ago. And it wasn't a reflection of death, but it was a reflection of who the hell am I? And am I actually going to show up in a way that matters? And I think when you think of something or someone as representing your potential legacy, what you leave behind in this world, you then automatically, even if you're not consciously thinking about it, you have to reflect on your own mortality, right? There'd be no need for succession. There would be no need for procreation. There would be no need for any of it if we, in fact, lived forever. But as mere mortals, this is how we, I guess, survive, maybe. But if nothing else, having children, which is probably the most alive feeling I'd ever experienced to date, ironically, put me in contact with, for the first time, feelings of mortality and the urgency with which you have to live your life because the runway is the end of the runway is catching up to you. Heidegger also talks about this sort of dichotomous nature of living mindfully, of not just being not just being mindful of how things are going, but of really reflecting on our own sense of being. And what this brings to us is this dichotomous sense of both freedom and nothingness. And look, if you're someone who is religious and believes in an afterlife, then I'm not entirely sure if this applies to you. I'm not sure, to be blunt, what I believe right now. Um, so I'm not hanging my hat on some potential some potential afterlife that is going to keep all this going. But that really spoke to me, that this mindfulness of being, to be living with full conscious awareness of the possibility and the inevitability of death, has both given me this marvelous sense of freedom in my life, and also I've had to struggle with what he calls nothingness. I almost want to call, from a macro perspective, utter irrelevance. I'm not irrelevant to my family. I'm not irrelevant to the people that I help in the moment. But in the grand scheme of things, if you peel it back far enough, you know, nothing but a single grain of sand on a beach that stretches off into infinity, there is a sense of nothingness there. But I think we can choose to be destroyed by that, or to be weighed down by that. Or again, that's the other side of the same coin that talks about freedom and liberation. But this is your only shot. And so what if you take some risks? So what if you don't get it right? So what, if it's not perfect or textbook? My screwing it up isn't going to change anything, really. And I'm not talking about making catastrophic bad decisions. I'm not talking about packing up and leaving my family and going to wander the wilderness. I'm not talking about that. There's still no question about honoring all of the obligations and the responsibilities that I've really willingly taken on. And that's not what I'm not even reflecting on that. That's not what I'm talking about. But, as I'm sitting on the edge of changing careers, I'm scared. I'll be honest, um, of maybe losing the safety and the predictability of what I had and moving off into the wilderness of, eat what you kill kind of entrepreneurialism. And that's frightening. But Yalom also talks about the best way to die is to live well, right? That the better you live, the as you approach the end, when you have fewer regrets, the fewer regrets that you can allow to accumulate, you're more likely to face death with some measure of peace and contentedness and grace and courage. And I have read so many accounts of people who are in their late stages of life, who are looking back on life with so many regrets, and very few wish that they had gone to the office more. Very few wish that they had just eked out a slightly better pension. Very few wish that they'd gotten a better title, or that they could have that truck that they always wanted, or that they could get more square footage in their home. But it's about the the regret of not having summoned up the courage to do what in their heart and in their gut and in their soul tells them that this is the path that I'm supposed to walk. And ironically, it is this sometimes feels like omnipresent sense of fear around death that is sparking something in me that I don't really understand yet, but I'm excited for it. You know, not talking about the missed experiences of watching my children grow up and having grandkids and getting to be old with my wife, but if I were to die tomorrow, could I say that I gave it a good go? Could I say that I really lived? No, no, no. And I don't like that. That makes me very sad and scared. But it doesn't have to be this way. These urgent experiences light us up. I remember, probably 3 years ago now, I had what turned out to be my first gallbladder attack. And if you've never had a gallbladder attack, well, you're fortunate. I mean, there are certainly a lot of worse things that you could have. Um, but I didn't know what it was. And it manifested quite unexpectedly, ironically, on my birthday with like this like hot searing pain right through my chest. And I could feel it radiating out my back and it was burning. And as someone who likes to break things and dislocate things and just generally if I can find a way to be injured, I will do it. I have dealt with pain, not horrible chronic pain in in a debilitating sense, but I can handle pain, essentially what I'm trying to say. I've got a high threshold of pain. And I remember sitting in the hospital as the doctors and nurses were trying to figure out what was going on, and the fear of the unknown around what I was experiencing was way worse than the pain that I was feeling. And it was in the middle of the pandemic, so I was in the hospital by myself, and there was genuinely a time, a couple hours, where I wasn't entirely sure that I wasn't dying. I had to rely on some logic. The doctors don't seem to be freaking out, but they're paying close attention and they're a little stymied. And it was really interesting. I was kind of panicking. And I actually overheard a doctor say to one of the nurses, he's going to be fine. He's just freaking out. He's not going to die. I have a couple theories. None of them are critical. He needs to get through the psychological piece of this before we can kind of really address the rest. And fortunately for me, I heard that with a level of lucidity. I was able to go, okay, well, that's not cool. I don't like someone to tell me that, I'm just freaking out, but I wasn't dying. But those 2 or 3 hours where I was unsure and I was very scared, I think was also a pretty significant catalyst for starting to try to live life on my own terms. I'm not a big poetry guy, um, but a friend of mine, a phenomenal psychotherapist out of the US called Michael Gay, recommended a book called 10 Poems to Change Your Life. It's a aggregation. And I'm not a big poetry guy, but I try to be, and I try to take it in. And I was reading this book, 10 Poems to Change Your Life, and there's a poem called For the Anniversary of My Death by W.S. Merwin. I won't read the whole thing. Nothing is more annoying, I think, to be honest, unless you're going to go out and actively seek someone listening to poetry, than to hear someone recite poetry. But bear with me. It starts every year without knowing it. I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me, and the silence will set out, tireless traveler, like the beam of a lightless star. I am someone who has spent hours comforted by and gazing into a fire. It's a pretty privileged thing to be able to say, but one of the things that I always say when I have a house is I want a fireplace. I need a wood burning fireplace in my homes. It's something that's important to me. I had it growing up. It's something that's important to me. And that line, when the last fires will wave to me, rocked me to my soul, rocked me to my core. The thought that at some point in my life, I will stare at the last fire, that it will wave to me for the last time. And the ironic thing is I likely won't know that that was the last time. It ends mildly out of context, but hearing the wren sing and the falling cease and bowing, not knowing to what. What's potent to me is that my daughter's middle name is Wren. Death is scary as hell, but we need to talk about it. We need to recognize it. We need to understand that it is not only a necessary and inevitable part of our lives, but if we can embrace it, it is the idea of it that can save us from a forgetful, inauthentic life where we are carried around by the nobody, and that we can move into a state of mindfulness, of freedom, and liberty, knowing that there is nothing there. There's no eternal consequence for getting it wrong, but God, there's no argument, no case to be made for not giving it a good go. If I'm halfway there, okay, that means I've got a lot of work to do in a pretty short period of time. And the hauntingness, the pangs of that forgetfulness of being, that there is a false sense of security in being unaware of the self, of denying that death will come one day. And it's romantic. It's like a siren song that pulls you to just lull you back to sleep, to push you into the numb. And it calls from time to time. Life would be just so much easier if I could just go back on autopilot. But I know that if I do that, there will come a day where the wren will sing no more and the last fire will have waved to me and it will have all been a waste and there's nothing that I could do about it now. And I cannot allow that to happen. And I'm guessing you can't either. So don't be lulled by the siren song of forgetfulness, of inauthentic passage of time as if it's never going to go, as if it's never going to run out. Have the courage to recognize that you are going to die. And so am I. And so will everybody at some point. And while it's not a pleasant thought, it is all the permission that I think we need to step into the freedom, to embrace the nothingness, and just listen to your heart, listen to your gut, and to live. To borrow a line from one of my favorite movies, to live life in every breath. If nothing else, I would like to normalize the conversations of death, that we can talk about death outside of the context of war or suicide or pain and suffering, and acknowledge that it's one of the great unifiers of this very weird existence, and to have the courage to explore what that means. And as I said, for it to grant you permission, if you need it, to live authentically, to really live. Thank you for listening to me work through some of these things. It's been a fascinating experience. And if you are in pain and if you are struggling, then please, reach out for help. 988, 911, friends, family, therapists. But, even if you're in a safer, more comfortable place right now in your life, I would urge you to contemplate what that might mean. Um, and to allow it to change your perspective just a little bit, and to no longer be carried along by the nobody. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening.